It's a high-stakes blitz battle between two of the world's best, Fabiano Caruana, with the white pieces taking on Sergey Karjakin. A quiet, symmetrical start. Both players fianchetto their king's bishops, developing pieces and castling into a solid mirror image setup on the board. Caruana stakes his claim in the center with pawn to e4, and Karjakin immediately challenges it with knight to f6. Here, Caruana chooses a quieter path, but there was a more ambitious way to fight for the center. The stronger try was pawn to d4, pawn takes on d4, the knight recaptures on d4, black castles kingside, and pawn to c3, cementing white's central control. But in the game, Caruana plays queen to e2, a more passive choice that allows black to get comfortable. Black solidifies the center with pawn to d5. The next several moves see both sides maneuvering their pieces, with the position remaining balanced and complex. Karjakin pushes his pawn to d4, forcing the issue. After some repositioning, the central pawns are traded off. And right here, Karjakin makes a slip, handing the initiative over to white. A much better plan was to prepare to fight on the long diagonal. The best move was queen to d7, bishop to b2, pawn to b6, knight to c4, and bishop to a6, putting pressure on white's structure. Instead of that, Karjakin jumps his knight to d5, and now white is the one with the advantage. Caruana immediately capitalizes, playing bishop to b2 and seizing control of the long diagonal. But black's response, pawn to h6, is too slow. It's another inaccuracy that allows white to build up a solid advantage, and Caruana does just that, methodically increasing the pressure. The rooks and knights reposition, and the c-pawn advances, squeezing black on the queen side. Just as white's advantage is cresting, he makes an inaccurate pawn push that releases all the tension. Keeping the pressure on was much stronger. The correct idea was queen to e3, rook to b8, bishop to a3, queen to c7, and knight takes the pawn on psi5, winning material. But in the game, Caruana pushes his pawn to d4, letting black right back into the game. This initiates a flurry of exchanges in the center. The pawns and then the knights come off the board, simplifying the position into equality. And here, Karjakin finds the only move to keep the balance. A fantastic recapture. Pawn takes the knight on c6. And here's the brilliant point. If white plays pawn to h4, the queen can snap the pawn on a2. Rook to a1 tries to trap it, but the queen escapes to b3, and black is simply winning a piece. Wow! Fabiano Caruana responds with a brilliant move, knight to d4. He sacrifices a knight out of nowhere to rip open lines and create massive complications. Karjakin accepts the sacrifice, and we enter a wild middle game. White is down a piece, but has tremendous compensation in the form of active pieces and threats everywhere. Both sides maneuver carefully, with black's queen swinging over to a5, looking for counterplay. And here, Caruana lets the attack slip. He had a strong way to continue pressing and win material. The correct idea was queen to e3, rook to b2, bishop takes the pawn on a7, rook to c8, and the bishop returns to c5, simply winning a pawn. But back in the game, he plays bishop to b4, a move that loses the thread and hands the advantage back to black. Karjakin immediately takes advantage. The queen repositions, the rook lifts to b3, and a few moves later, that rook snaps off the pawn on a3. White is in trouble, and this move makes things much worse. The best defensive path was to simplify by trading queens. The correct line was queen takes the pawn on c6, the queens are traded off, bishop recaptures, rook to c8, and bishop to d7, where white is only slightly worse. Instead, Caruana plays bishop to b2, and after this, black's rook becomes an absolute monster. The black rook crashes into a2, and now the passed c-pawn starts rolling forward to c5, creating overwhelming threats. White's position is on the brink, and this move is a decisive mistake that puts black in a completely winning position. The only way to hold on was a tough defensive move. The engine finds queen to b1, rook to a5, bishop to c3, rook to a3, and queen to b2, just trying to survive. But in the game, Caruana plays bishop to e3, and this simply loses a key central pawn, and Karjakin cashes in immediately. Bishop takes the pawn on e5. Caruana tries to create counterplay with pawn to h4, but it's an inaccuracy that doesn't address the real problems. The simple king to g1 was a better defensive try, and now Karjakin lets some of his advantage slip, missing the most direct path to victory. The fastest way to win was to push on the king side immediately. The killer line was pawn to h5, rook to e1, pawn to a5, bishop to h6, and bishop to d4, and white's position collapses. But instead, he plays rook to b8, giving white a little bit of breathing room. White pushes forward on the king side, creating some threats, black parries, and this leads to a trade of rooks on the c-file. An absolutely brilliant find from Caruana. Queen takes the rook on c2 is the only move that keeps him in the game. Here's the critical idea. If black plays rook to b2, white has queen to e4, and after pawn to a5, queen to a8 delivers a check, winning black's rook on the back rank. Seeing the trap, Karjakin calmly improves his king's position with king to g7. But white's reply, rook to e1, is an inaccuracy that lets black consolidate. He missed a chance with bishop to d5, which would have created serious problems and won a piece. And now Karjakin's rook swings back into the attack, landing on b4. And this is the final decisive error. This move loses on the spot. White had to keep fighting with active pieces. The only chance was bishop to d5, the bishops are exchanged, pawn recaptures, bishop to d4, and queen to f5, trying to hold the position together. But after the move in the game, bishop to d2, black can simply capture a pawn and seal the victory. The rook snaps the pawn on c4, and from here it's a matter of technique. Karjakin methodically improves his position, and white's defenses are crumbling. And another brilliant shot from Karjakin. Rook to c4, a stunning sacrifice that completely shatters white's remaining coordination. Caruana is forced to capture the bishop on f6 with check, but after black recaptures, the position is completely winning. White makes a few last defensive attempts, bringing the rook to d1, but black's passed pawns are simply too strong. Unbelievable. A second brilliant sacrifice from Karjakin, rook to d4. He gives up the rook just to eliminate white's last active piece and simplify into a one endgame. White has no choice but to accept the sacrifice. Rook takes the rook on d4, and pawn takes the rook on d4 is the crushing final blow. This creates a passed d-pawn that cannot be stopped from queening, and the game is over. And at this point, Fabiano Caruana resigns. A wild back-and-forth victory for Sergey Karjakin, who is now up a full piece with unstoppable pawns. Queen to f3, bishop takes the bishop on d5, the queen takes back, queen to e5, and queen to b7, and there's no way to stop black from winning everything.